Now I'd like to re-invite to the podium New Zealand representative Captain Turner to read out a message on behalf of a New Zealand veteran.
You'll be fed up with the sight of me soon, won't you? So, like many of you, I have a Facebook account. Up until approximately 12 months ago, I decided that I wasn't going to need one and that life for me would simply go on as normal without it, after all. What on earth could Facebook do for me? Well, to be honest, I'm kind of still of the same opinion, although since being in South Korea, it has helped me to keep up to date with things that happen at the New Zealand Embassy. Yep, you think I know everything that happens there, because I work there, but to be honest, the embassy gets into everything. And Ambassador Turner, I spend a lot of time looking at your Facebook page for the embassy, and sometimes I struggle to keep up. But thank you for letting me in. However, one of the groups I joined was the K-Force New Zealand group, which is a group whose purpose is to correctly remember and honour family members and their colleagues, both living and past, who voluntarily served New Zealand and the British Commonwealth in the Korean War. Well, recently I posted to this group asking for any anecdotes, stories, or simply names I could read out and acknowledge, seeing as our veterans can't be with us. One of the replies I received back was from Kevin Everett, who is a key player and moderator of this group. Kevin tells me, and I quote, that K-Force members Alan Coe and Colin Stambridge were delighted to receive a phone call from me yesterday. Alan, a K-Force original, recently turned 98 years of age, and my late father, Les Everett, served under Alan in the Royal New Zealand Dental Corps, attached to 16th Field Regiment in Korea. Colin, on the other hand, was also a K-Force original, and he was with 163 Battery most of his time, and he is currently 95 years of age. So turning back to Alan, he says that Alan was reluctant to say much about Gapyeong, and rather hoped I would get a word or two out of Colin instead, which, to be honest, I didn't until later. Kevin goes on to tell me that Alan has written in the past about Gapyeong and has also spoken to me over time, mainly highlighting the chaotic scene of the regiment following orders to take positions in the Gapyeong Valley while Korean civilians and soldiers were fleeing along the same valley road in the opposite direction. Kevin has shown me photographs of hundreds and hundreds of people moving quickly south with the Chinese hard on their heels. The road was more or less blocked. You know what? It must have been the most distressing and frightening time. One funny anecdote was from Alan's earlier discussions on how the original or main body of the K-Force was not as well equipped as some other armies. Alan says that this worked in our favour. When the Americans had to beat a hasty withdrawal, leaving all manner of equipment behind. So immediately following the Battle of Gapyeong, and remember, he's in the Dental Corps, at one place an American unit had bid a hasty retreat and had left behind, amongst other things, a large tent, which the dental section gratefully appropriated. Thank you very much. He then says we arrived one night at an American engineers camp, and all the Americans had disappeared into the sunset. They hadn't even left one person there. They'd done a runner. So the Kiwis in their own style had quite a time. K-rations, food rations, cigarettes, and also there happened to be a tent or two. So that explained how we got our even bigger tent. I can only imagine that dentistry still has to be performed in the field of battle, but sounds as though they got two large tents to carry on their work. Alan also recounted in the past how the Canadians were very good to us. And Alan says, I'd asked my driver to go and see them about something, and he'd come back with a jeep full of equipment. When asked, Alan's driver would say, "Oh, they gave it to me, the Canadians." They said, "Take it, this might come in handy." They had a much better setup than anyone else. So Alan says thank you to the 2nd Battalion Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. Turning now to Colin, who was now stirred into providing a story or two of his own, recounted to Kevin that he was a lowly gun position officer with the 163rd Battery Fox Troop, and how the 27th British Commonwealth Battalion was in reserve with the 162nd Battery, giving the Argyll and Southern Highlanders a send-off with a hangi, a Maori-style feast, whilst the 161st and the 163rd Battery were following the orders of the Americans to take position in the Gapyeong Valley to support the Rock 6 Division. Colin was grateful for the local defence provided by the 1st Middlesex Regiment as his battery returned up the valley, but recounted, like Alan, the chaos with Korean civilians and soldiers fleeing south down the same valley road. Eventually the order was given to withdraw and regroup, and the batteries transported the Middlesex soldiers by whatever means possible. Colin recounted his last order at Gapyeong, and the order from the battery commander with the Australians was to fire until the last round before withdrawing. Colin is very proud of the fact that the regiment held the line in defence of the Commonwealth Brigade, providing a firm base at Gapyeong. Both Alan and Colin went on to tell me they are very grateful for the commemoration held here at Gapyeong each year, and are moved by the gratitude continually expressed by the Korean people even today. My next story is about a neighbour of mine. His name is Tony Skilton. And he lives back in New Zealand, and until I joined the Facebook group, I had no idea about his father's involvement in the Korean War, and neither did Tony realise that I would be here at Gapyeong today until he saw my Facebook post. Now, Tony's father was at the time of Gapyeong Major Vincent G. Skilton, Military Cross, Royal New Zealand Artillery. He went on to retire as a Lieutenant Colonel in 1968 after 32.5 years service. Vincent kept a journal of his time in Korea, and specifically in Gapyeong, and Tony sent it to me. It's a really fascinating read, but for now, I'll just read how Vincent describes the enemy. It gives a picture of the type of enemy our boys were up against, and helps us define the strength, resilience, and bravery of the Commonwealth Division in the face of such a hugely determined enemy who attacked wave after wave in vastly superior numbers. So Major Vincent Skilton goes on to say, "The Chinaman was a bold and courageous fighter, both in attack and defence. He was accustomed to hardships, and he carried several days' supply of food on his person. He had very little administrative tail. His morale was at all times high. His field defences were excellent, and he was a master at digging and tunnelling. He was equipped with a wide range of weapons of Japanese, Russian, and American origin, and notwithstanding this, proved to be a very good weapon handler. Against this, he appeared to be driven rather than led, and like many other good soldiers, was reputed to be fond of loot. For that reason, control was apt to be lost once he was on an objective. He used specially selected troops for most of this work, and their fieldcraft was first class. His patrols did an excellent job of lifting our mines and laying them again in the minefield gaps that we thought were safe. He was also very keen on moving our minefield fences in order that our patrols went into the minefields instead of the gaps that we thought were safe. On one occasion, our sappers plus infantry assault pioneers had laid a minefield in front of our forward company position. This task taking some 4 hours after last light. In the morning, it was found that the Chinaman had lifted the minefield and stacked the mines in neat heaps outside our wire. His fighting patrols had a lot of success in knocking off American OPLRs, that is, his outpost line of resistance. These consisted of a non-commissioned officer and up to 12 men, all in positions on small features up to 300 yards in front of the platoon positions. In the last 12 months of the war, the enemy had amassed a large number of guns of all calibers. They provided very good close support to his major attacks, but due to poor communications, they were very slow to react to attacks by us. The guns were used extensively during daylight hours on harassing fire tasks in our forward company areas. A notable point was his rapid and effective mortar fire when patrol-sized contacts took place. The Chinaman used his mortars very effectively, and the major portion of our day-to-day casualties came from these weapons. The enemy went to tremendous lengths to ensure the evacuation of his wounded and dead from the battlefield. I can remember that in one attack he had follow-up companies whose sole task was casualty evacuation. Even after patrol clashes, when fighting patrols were sent out to sweep the area concerned, all that would be found were bloodstains, enemy weapons on occasions, and the other usual signs of a firefight. I do not mean by this that we never found bodies or wounded, but it was very unusual to do so. Moving to my next veteran, Lieutenant Robert Chesham was an artillery officer in 16th Field Regiment. He deployed to Korea in January 1951, with the 1st Echelon serving on the gun position with 161 Battery during the Battle of Gapyeong, and later as a forward observer supporting attacks on hills 355 and 517. He was wounded during this battle, and he returned to Korea 50 years after the war and was overwhelmed by the incredible developments and appreciation shown by the Korean people. In 2019, he had this to say: "I can honestly say that I'm proud to have been part of the Korean War. One of the greatest things I found was a special way the Korean people treated us when we went back. If I met a Korean person, even though they are strangers, they come and thank me for my service, and we know that the Korean people appreciate us. Like most men in the New Zealand K-Force, we feel we have a stake in and contributed to the Korea of today, and we are proud to have done so." Robert passed away 18 months ago during the COVID lockdown. His wife directed me to an interview with a Korean social studies education interviewer in 2019. You can find the interview on YouTube under Korean War Legacy Foundation. And if you watch the interview, you will quickly see that Robert still had a great sense of humor at the age of 94. During the interview, and noting that the Korean War was still technically active, he said, "When I joined the war, my terms of service that I was available for service for the duration of the war and 6 months afterwards. So, theoretically, I could be called back into the service in Korea. Perhaps if they knew that in North Korea, that might bring them back to the peace table." And my last two messages are short. They are as follows. The first one from Dennis and Heather Wilkes. Dennis is married to Heather, who is the daughter of veteran Murray Forsyth. Dennis says, "I'm writing to you on behalf of my father-in-law, Murray Forsyth. Army number 203599. He was with 161 Battery Baker Troop and was one of the originals and served at the Battle of Gapyeong. He currently lives in Tauranga and is 94 years old. I don't often look at Facebook, but noticed your post today. So my wife Heather, Murray's daughter, mentioned to him about the commemoration on the 22nd, and Murray asked if I could tape it for him. So I'm wondering if it will be broadcast on any media that I could record on my phone somehow to replay to him." Well, Murray, hopefully this is being recorded and we'll get it to you somehow. Dennis goes on to say that Murray remembers being right in the thick of it and will never forget that time. They spent 4 days and 4 nights without sleep, and he wondered if he would ever get home again. And finally, my final message is from Darcy Kemp. Darcy asked that I acknowledge his father, driver Leslie Robert Kemp, 208273 New Zealand Army Support Corps, career 1951 to 1953. Thank you for your service, Leslie Robert Kemp, and thank you to all New Zealand veterans for what you did for the future of South Korea 71 years ago.
Thank you, Captain Turner. We will now proceed with the wreath laying. Tributes will be laid concurrently at both memorials.